Alrighty guys, today we will be looking at 4 different Kloss mousepads, all from Germany, which I have been using these past few weeks and have been slowly but surely converting me back to using controlled mousepads. So first of all, we have the Piranha Mousemods S1P. Now the S in S1P actually stands for speed, but after doing some testing, I found that the performance profile of the S1P much more matches up to a balanced controlled mousepad. Coming in at 500 by 500 by 3.5 millimeters, the PMM S1P has an incredibly sticky polyurethane base. This is the same base as you will find on the C1P, although on the S1P it is a little bit harder. They both have the same 3.5 millimeter thickness, but this does give way a little bit less. That means that it is a lot more compatible with dot skates, because as you press into the pad, they won't bottom out as easily as they do on the C1P. In terms of the surface texture, there is a very slight surface texturing, but I definitely wouldn't call it rough, comparing it to the Hien or the Key 83, for example, which have a much more obvious surface texturing than the S1P. With the very light surface texturing, but also the responsive base, the performance profile of the S1P is incredibly well balanced. By using different skates, I could either get it to be a lot more controlled or a lot more speedy, depending on what I wanted in the situation. The stitching is incredibly high quality. It's below the surface, and I didn't feel it at all while playing. This moves me on to the C1P, which shares a lot of similarities to the S1P when it comes to the stitching quality as well as the base quality. The one major standout difference is that this is an extremely slow pad. This is not something that I would recommend for people who are switching over from quicker pads like maybe glass pads or a Raiden of some sort. But what I will say is that I was incredibly surprised with how well I got on with this. When I first started playing, I thought there is no way I can play with this. My first impression was that the pad was just way too slow. Because the base on the C1P is a little bit plusher than on the S1P, the use of dot skates on it wasn't as enjoyable, as they would bottom out very quickly when putting any kind of pressure into the base. However, switching over to stock feet like on my OP1 8K, the pad became incredibly enjoyable. Even for someone like me who typically enjoys faster pads, I really had a good time playing on this mousepad. Within the first 1 or 2 attempts, I broke a lot of my voltaic scores, and granted, I have not been aim training a lot recently. The control that this pad offers is really incredible. It is truly unique. I've never felt something like this before from a control pad. This really is the pinnacle of control in my personal opinion. Now bear in mind, this is coming from someone who isn't a massive fan of control mousepads. I also don't typically like very soft mousepads. Even other control pads that I have, like the Artisan Zero, for example, I have in a mid thickness just because I prefer to have a little bit of a harder base so that I can use dot skates on it as well. But once I got past the issue of the slightly more plushy base, this was incredibly enjoyable to play on, and I can only recommend it if PMM ever re-release this pad in a non-serialized iteration. But with that, we come to one of the major drawbacks of both of these mousepads, who are definitely gonna both be staples in my rotation for the foreseeable future. At the moment, only 100 of both of these pads have been released. This means that if you haven't already picked one up, it is very unlikely that you're going to be able to find one unless PMM re-release them. Now, I do think this is currently the plan, so I would stay updated with PMM's social media to see when they re-release these pads, because they are absolutely worth picking up if you are any kind of FPS player. Even outside of games, just having these on my desk while I was doing spreadsheet work or doing classwork, they felt incredible. I know this isn't something that is typically included in gaming peripheral reviews, but I think it's important to note that these are pads that you can just use all day. If I have a glass mousepad on my desk and I'm doing some Excel spreadsheets and I can't control what cell I'm clicking on, it's not a good experience. I'll have to switch out my mousepad every single time that I do something different at my computer. But with these mousepads, I can just keep them here, not a single problem. But I don't want to glaze these mousepads too much. Although for PMM's first mousepad release, I really cannot state enough how incredible these pads feel. The quality, everything is truly amazing. The question will be is, if they re-release these pads in much higher numbers, will the quality control be as good and as consistent, or will it start dropping off a little bit? I hope, based on PMM's reputation, that they will keep up this high quality, but only time will tell. Moving on to the next pad, I have the Anvil mousepad from Champions Forge here. Now, this is a mousepad made by the ex-Rainbow Six pro coach Zua, who made this mousepad in collaboration with a lot of different pros who kind of gave their input on what they're looking for from a mousepad. The mousepad is significantly cheaper than the two other options that we're going to be talking about in this video, coming in at 40 euros, making it very, very affordable. Although there might be some problems with shipping considering Champions Forge is a slightly smaller company than the other two. But it's something to bear in mind that this is a far more budget option and far more accessible than the PMM pads that we previously discussed. Outside of the price, one of the major issues that I have with this mousepad is the sizing. I wish that it came in a square size as well, because it's just something that I've gotten used to playing on. But unfortunately, this 500 by 417 is the only size option available. The pad is 3.75mm thick with a 3.5mm polyurethane base. It is the same base material as the PMM pads, but it's not quite as sticky. You'll see in a second as well that the RIZ V2 uses the same or a very similar kind of base, but they're both just simply not as good as the PMM's execution. In terms of the base thickness and bounciness, it sits kind of between the C1P and the S1P, so it has a reasonable dot skate tolerance. I could absolutely use dot skates on this mousepad without it being a massive issue, but it wasn't quite as enjoyable as it was on the S1P, for example. On the arm, the mousepad feels slightly fuzzy, I think you could say. The website describes it as being silky, because it has an acrylic thread that runs through the mousepad. Just like the base, the speed of this mousepad sits perfectly in between the two PMM options, meaning that it is still an incredibly controlled mousepad. It doesn't feel like a mud pad because the dynamic and static friction are very similar, but just bear in mind that it is still very controlled. Because the company is a little bit smaller as well, the stitching on the edges isn't quite as high quality as on the PMM or on the Laonda pad that we're going to be looking at in a second. But for the price, it is absolutely more than good. There are some small inconsistencies along the sides, but nothing that I noticed really during gameplay or something that would massively impact performance. So if you can look past the sizing options and the slight quality control issues that you might find, then this is absolutely one of the best budget picks for a mousepad that are out there at the moment. If you're a TAC FPS player and you're looking for something new, or you just want to try something else to what you have right now, the Champions Forge Anvil is something that I can absolutely recommend. Last but not least, we have this behemoth of a mousepad. This is the Laonda RIZ V2. Now, this is the 600 by 500 size, which costs around 55 euros, but it also comes in a slightly smaller square form factor of 490 by 490 millimeters as well. As I mentioned previously, it has the same kind of polyurethane base that the other two pads have, but the implementation of this is a lot more similar to that of the Anvil than compared to the PMM pads. Just like the other three pads, it also has a 3.5mm base thickness, and just like the Anvil and the PMM S1P, it works pretty well with any kinds of dot skates. I would still recommend sticking to full-size skates, but if you're someone that likes dot skates or likes switching skates in between mice, this is still a mousepad that will work for you. Out of the 4 mousepads discussed so far, this is the quickest out of all of them. It is faster than the S1P. Now, it is not a fast or even a balanced pad by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it is good to mention as well that it is the quicker out of the controlled options. Personally, I think this is because the surfacing is incredibly smooth. Going over it with the arm, it is incredibly smooth to the touch, and it honestly just feels amazing. But at the same time, this is probably what makes the glide a little bit quicker. In terms of the production quality, Laonda has the most experience in mass producing mousepads, so you can expect the quality control to really be honed in, and it's not really going to change much as we go along. There are several different color alternatives, and Laonda have a wide array of different mousepads as well, like the Pels or the Valhout, but those are nowhere near as controlled as the RIZ will be. When looking close up to the knitting of the pad, it is a lot tighter knit than the other control options, which is probably also what contributes to this very quick glide. This is actually a pad that I've had for quite a while, unlike the other 3 mouse pads, and it's kind of just been sitting around because, as I mentioned, I really am someone that enjoys quicker pads. I play a lot on glass pads, I play on a Raiden Mid, for example, and these kinds of pads, which just have much lower static and dynamic friction. But after trying out all of these pads, I do really have to say I'm incredibly positively surprised by all of them. Germans are sometimes known as masters of engineering, and when I look at what these companies have produced, I really can only agree. All 4 of these mouse pads are incredibly, incredibly good, and I really recommend that you try all of them out if you ever get the opportunity to. Going from quickest to slowest, or from least controlled to most controlled, it would be the RIZ, then the S1P, then the Anvil, then the C1P. Now, when I say least controlled, they're all still very controlled pads and a lot more controlled than any of the balanced pads or speed pads that are out there, but everything is relative, right? I enjoyed all of these pads with a wide variety of skates. Like I mentioned, the C1P really is the only one of these pads that I wouldn't recommend using dot skates on, unless you really apply absolutely no downward force on your mouse when you're aiming. Overall, these mouse pads felt incredible in static flicking scenarios, as well as target switching and tracking, because I just felt like I had perfect control over everything that I was doing. After using speed pads for such a long time, I really got used to that really low dynamic and static friction. But coming back to these mouse pads, I remembered how useful it can be to have a mouse pad to press into when it comes to stopping your flicks. Everything just felt so much more consistent and like I had more control over what I was doing on my mouse pad, that it was really a eye-opening experience. Now, does this mean I'm throwing all of my speed pads out of the window and I'm only ever going to be playing on super controlled pads? Obviously not. But I think for games and for players that are really focusing on tag FPS kind of shooters, these kinds of pads are really something to bear in mind. And out of my experience, both of the PMM pads, the Laonda RIZ and the Champions Forge Anvil, are all mouse pads that are definitely to be recommended for people in that kind of niche. Thank you very much for watching my comparison of these 4 speed pads. Now, bear in mind, there are still a bunch of different good speed pads out there, like an Artisan Zero or an LG Saturn Pro, but these are mouse pads that I don't see being spoken about quite as often as those more mainstream options, and I felt like they definitely deserve to be in the spotlight for once. All 4 of these pads are extremely solid options, and if they fall within the price point that you're looking for, I can absolutely recommend them. There are not many control pads that I would recommend, but these 4 have definitely brought me a little bit closer back to the control side. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any suggestions or requests for future videos, leave them down in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. See ya.